In 1960, federal investigators exposed a secret buried inside one of America's most respected industrial icons. To the public, Allis-Chalmers was the backbone of American infrastructure. But behind closed doors, its executives were part of a criminal conspiracy that rigged the contracts behind America's power grid. This wasn't just a business mistake. It was a $200 million betrayal. Today, we're uncovering the corporate rot that poisoned an American legend. Edward P. Allis purchased the bankrupt Reliance Works in Milwaukee in 1861 and rebuilt it into a successful machinery business. In 1901, that business was combined with Fraser & Chalmers, Gates Iron Works, and Dixon Manufacturing to form Allis-Chalmers, which grew into one of the most diversified industrial producers in America. The product list alone tells the story. Steam turbines, hydraulic turbines, electrical generators, industrial motors, mining equipment, construction machinery, and tractors, especially tractors. The agricultural division became the public face of the company for millions of Americans. The distinctive Persian orange color, introduced in 1929, made Allis-Chalmers machines instantly recognizable across the American Farm Belt. The Model U tractor, introduced in 1929, made history in late 1932 when it became the first commercially successful farm tractor to trade steel wheels for rubber tires. That was not a small thing. Rubber tires changed how farmers worked. They allowed higher field speeds, reduced soil compaction, and made the tractor far more versatile. Allis-Chalmers did not just sell that innovation. They demonstrated it by hiring racing driver Barney Oldfield to drive a rubber-tired Model U at roughly 30 to 35 miles per hour during Allis-Chalmers exhibitions, leading up to the 1933 Chicago World's Fair. They understood spectacle. They understood how to make people believe in what they were building. The company's reach extended well beyond the farm. Allis-Chalmers built several of the hydraulic turbines for Hoover Dam. When the first generators roared to life in 1936, Allis-Chalmers Engineering helped power the Southwest. The company also supplied equipment for the Robert Moses Niagara Power Plant in New York, one of the largest hydroelectric facilities in the world at the time of its construction. These were not peripheral contributions. They were central to the infrastructure that powered modern American life. The federal government trusted Allis-Chalmers with some of the most consequential engineering projects in the country, and the company delivered. During World War II, the company turned its factories toward the war effort with the same scale it brought to everything else. Allis-Chalmers produced tank components, naval equipment, and electrical equipment for military applications. The company's West Allis, Wisconsin facility was one of the largest manufacturing complexes in the country, covering approximately 130 acres of factory floor and employing tens of thousands of workers at its peak. When the war ended and America turned back toward building itself, Allis-Chalmers was positioned at the center of that effort. But that same rise placed the company inside one of the richest and most secretive corners of American industry. And in that world, the competition the public thought it was seeing was not always real. The post-war decades brought enormous infrastructure investment across the United States. New power plants, expanded electrical grids, industrial facilities scaling up to meet the demands of a growing economy. Allis-Chalmers was a major supplier to all of it. The company built large power transformers, switchgear, turbine generators, and other heavy electrical equipment that utilities and industrial customers needed in enormous quantities. That boom put Allis-Chalmers in position to cash in. Utilities were expanding rapidly, cities were growing, suburbs were spreading, and electric demand was climbing year after year. Every new generating station, every grid expansion, every industrial build-out created demand for the exact kinds of products Allis-Chalmers specialized in. This was not a side business for the company. Heavy electrical equipment had become one of the most important and prestigious parts of its industrial empire. That prestige is what makes the scandal matter. When a company known for tractors gets caught cheating, it is embarrassing. When a company trusted to help power the country gets caught rigging bids, it feels like a betrayal of the public itself. These were not small purchases. A single large power transformer could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. A turbine generator installation could run into the millions. The contracts were enormous, the customers were powerful, and the stakes were very high. And because the stakes were so high, Buyers assumed the bidding was real. What they did not know was that some of the competition had already been decided before the bids were ever opened. The heavy electrical equipment market in the 1950s was not a crowded marketplace. It was a tight circle. A small number of companies dominated the industry. General Electric, Westinghouse, Allis-Chalmers, Federal Pacific Electric, ITE Circuit Breaker Company, and a handful of others. These companies competed for the same contracts, sold to the same customers, and knew each other's businesses intimately. Contracts were put out for competitive bid, and the expectation was simple. Companies would compete honestly, prices would be shaped by real rivalry, and the lowest responsible bidder would win the job. For the buyers, that process was supposed to be the safeguard. Utilities were spending enormous sums on equipment that would become part of the physical backbone of modern life. A transformer was not just a product, it was part of a city's grid. A generator was not just another sale. It was tied to homes, factories, streetlights, hospitals, and the daily function of entire regions. That is what made honest bidding so important. When competition worked, utilities could at least believe the price reflected reality. When it was manipulated, the damage spread outward. The extra cost did not stay inside a boardroom. It rippled through public budgets, industrial expansion, and the cost of building the systems Americans depended on. That is not what was happening. What was actually happening took place far from the bid documents and the public procurement processes. It happened in hotel rooms, in private phone calls, at industry gatherings where competitors would slip away from the official agenda and find a quiet corner. The executives and sales managers involved had a name for these meetings. They called them choir practice, a darkly ironic term for something that had nothing to do with harmony and everything to do with control. The name itself tells you something about the culture that had formed around the conspiracy. This was not treated like an emergency measure or a desperate one-time fix. It had been normalized. It had its own language, its own rhythm, and its own rules. That is often how industrial corruption survives. Once enough people inside an industry begin treating dishonest conduct as routine, it stops feeling like a crime to the men carrying it out. It begins to feel like procedure. The scheme was almost elegant in its deception. Companies that were supposed to be fierce competitors were, in fact, coordinating. They agreed in advance on who would win a given contract. They agreed on the prices each company would submit. The losing companies would file bids deliberately set too high, creating the appearance of competition while guaranteeing the predetermined winner got the job. They rotated the wins. They divided the market. They made sure everyone got their share while the customers, the utilities, the municipalities, the federal government paid prices that had been quietly inflated by the absence of any real competition. The customers had no idea. The bids came in on separate letterheads. The companies maintained their public posture of rivalry. The salesmen shook hands at trade shows and smiled at each other across conference tables as if they were adversaries. Behind that performance was a system that had been running in various forms for years. The coordination was not casual. It was organized. Participants kept track of whose turn it was to win a contract using a rotation schedule jokingly referred to as phases of the moon. The scheme divided the market into segments, and companies rotated the winning position on a predetermined schedule. When it was your turn to win, the others filed high. When it was someone else's turn, you filed high. The whole arrangement was designed to look, from the outside, exactly like a functioning competitive market. It was a performance, a long, profitable, carefully rehearsed performance. And that was the part that made the scandal so shocking. This was not sloppy cheating. It was organized, repeatable, and hidden inside companies the public considered pillars of American industry. Allis-Chalmers was not the dominant force in this arrangement. General Electric and Westinghouse were the biggest players, and the evidence suggested that much of the coordination flowed from the top of the industry downward. But Allis-Chalmers was in the room. Its employees participated. Its people attended the meetings, filed the coordinated bids, and benefited from the rigged outcomes. That participation made the company complicit, regardless of where the scheme originated. But every rigged system leaves a pattern, and eventually the numbers stopped looking honest. By 1959, suspicious bidding patterns, especially identical bids down to the penny, had attracted the attention of the Tennessee Valley Authority, setting off the federal investigation that culminated in 1960. To experienced procurement officials, the bids no longer looked like true competition. They looked choreographed. The TVA bought enormous quantities of electrical equipment, and its procurement staff knew exactly what a real bidding process was supposed to look like. What they were seeing did not look like that. They brought their concerns to the Justice Department, and the investigation accelerated. Investigators began subpoenaing documents and calling witnesses before a federal grand jury in Philadelphia. In 1960, the Justice Department handed down indictments against 29 companies and 45 executives and employees across the heavy electrical equipment industry. The charges centered on criminal violations of the Sherman Antitrust Act and made clear that this was not a technical dispute over paperwork. The government was alleging a deliberate conspiracy to rig one of the most important industrial markets in the country. At that point, the scandal was no longer a rumor inside the industry. It was a national story. Once the indictments were public, the secrecy that had protected the scheme for years was gone. What had been whispered in hotel rooms was now being read in headlines across the country. What made the moment explosive was that this was no longer a quiet antitrust dispute buried in paperwork. A federal grand jury in Philadelphia was hearing evidence in a criminal case, and the government was threatening prison. Allis-Chalmers was not just accused in the abstract. The scandal reached into the company's power equipment division, where employees had helped rig bids and fix prices for years. By the time the indictments landed, this was no longer a rumor moving through the industry. It was a public criminal reckoning. The guilty pleas came quickly, and that told its own story. Allis-Chalmers, along with several of the industry's biggest names, chose not to drag the facts through a long public trial. The company pleaded guilty, and several employees were implicated in the conspiracy, confirming that the scandal was not an outside accusation, but a real internal failure. The image of honorable industrial competition collapsed almost overnight. In the end, several executives received jail sentences, a shocking outcome in an era when corporate antitrust violations were usually punished with fines rather than prison time. The sentences were short, 30 days in most cases, but the symbolism was enormous. These were not street criminals. These were vice presidents and division managers of some of the most prestigious companies in America, and they were going to jail. Judge J. Coolin-Gainey, who presided over the sentencing in Philadelphia, did not mince words. He called the conspiracy a shocking indictment of a vast section of our economy. He said the defendants had flagrantly mocked the antitrust laws. He made clear that the court viewed what had happened not as a technical regulatory violation, but as a fundamental betrayal of the principles that were supposed to govern American commerce. The fines levied against the companies totaled millions of dollars, a figure that sounds modest today but carried real weight at the time. More damaging were the civil suits that followed. Utilities and other customers who had been overcharged began filing lawsuits to recover the excess prices they had paid. The initial wave of settlements totaled about $200 million, and later, civil suits pushed the industry's total payouts to well over $400 million. Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee held congressional hearings on the scandal in 1961, bringing the story directly into the national spotlight. Kefauver was a relentless investigator with a talent for public theater, and the hearings made front pages across the country. Allis-Chalmers faced its share of that exposure. And with every new headline, every new hearing, every new civil filing, the reputational damage deepened. The utilities, municipalities, and industrial buyers that purchased Allis-Chalmers equipment had been paying prices shaped not by real competition, but by collusion made to look like competition. The guilty plea opened up an even uglier question. If the conspiracy had been running inside a major division of the company for years, where was the board? At Allis-Chalmers, 14 directors met monthly and delegated most responsibility down the management chain. That structure became part of the next legal fight, when shareholders argued the directors had failed in their duty to supervise the corporation well enough to catch what was happening under their own roof. In the aftermath, shareholders brought what became the famous Graham versus Allis-Chalmers case, arguing that directors had failed to supervise the company well enough to catch or prevent the misconduct. The court ultimately sided with the directors, holding that they had not been shown to possess actual knowledge of the wrongdoing, and were not required to maintain a constant system of internal espionage absent warning signs. Even so, the case left an uncomfortable public question behind. How could conduct this serious continue inside a major corporation without leadership noticing? What made that second phase so important was that it shifted the scandal from conduct to culture. The question was no longer just whether employees had rigged bids. The question became whether a corporation this large could allow that kind of behavior to take root, because no one at the top was asking the right questions. In that sense, the scandal became a story not only about greed, but about distance. Distance between executives and operations. Distance between directors and the behavior inside their own divisions. Distance between the honorable image of the corporation and the hidden habits that image concealed. The answer, depending on who you believed, was either that the directors were genuinely deceived by subordinates operating in a hidden world below them, or that the culture of the company had allowed, and perhaps quietly rewarded, aggressive market behavior that eventually crossed into criminal territory. Neither answer was flattering. One described a leadership so detached from its own operations that a years-long criminal conspiracy could flourish undetected. The other described something worse. Allis-Chalmers continued operating after the scandal. The tractors kept rolling. The turbines kept turning. The company remained a significant industrial force through the 1960s and into the 1970s. It was not the price-fixing scandal that ultimately ended Allis-Chalmers. The company's later struggles came from a different set of pressures entirely: foreign competition, a brutal farm equipment downturn in the early 1980s, and financial difficulties that accumulated over years. The agricultural equipment division was sold to West Germany's Klöckner Humboldt Deutz in 1985, forming Deutz Allis. The remaining operations were restructured and eventually wound down. By the late 1980s, the original Allis-Chalmers manufacturing operations had largely disappeared from active commerce. But the scandal of 1960 did not disappear with it. It remained attached to the company's name long after the machines kept running. Today, the electrical equipment scandal is often remembered as a General Electric story because GE was the biggest and most famous name involved. But Allis-Chalmers was there. Its people sat in those hotel rooms. Its employees filed those coordinated bids. And in the end, the company stood before a federal judge and pleaded guilty.